Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 9th annual meeting of the Global Business School Network for Human Rights. I love seeing this group. We have a strong core group, but I'm equally delighted to see some new faces joining our work. Before we begin, I have to start with thanks. First to my team, heartfelt thanks to Sarah and Berit, who really helped to bring us all together here. The University of Geneva has been generally providing this room to us, and I'm most grateful that we can meet here every year. It's become such a treasured tradition for me to start off this very busy Human Rights Week at the Forum with all of you. Of course, I'm also really grateful to continue doing this work with Professor Michael Posner. He created the idea of bringing human rights to business school education with the NYU Stern Center for Business Human Rights. And of course, I'm also very happy that we have the continuous support of Dan Leclerc, who heads the Global Business School Network and who has been helping to grow and sustain our community. So this year, I feel especially strong about how meaningful this get-together is, not despite the times, but because of the times we're living in. I think providing a moral compass for the next generation is more important than ever, and I'm very happy to see you as my allies. As every year, we have a really packed agenda. Maybe we can pull up the agenda, Sarah. We have 3 clusters. First, we start off with a panel. Really excited to have fantastic speakers that could offer their brief reflections on what's going on in the world. We live in tumultuous times. We have speakers from different regions, from India remotely, from South Africa remotely, from different disciplines, ethics and entrepreneurship, but also from practice. Kirsten is here. Mike is here, of course, commenting on what's going on in the US. It will be moderated by Dan, so this will be the first 45 minutes. We really hope to carve out time for your reactions and questions. And then in a second cluster, we'll hear from the research clusters that are part of our network. In total, we have 7 today. 3 will provide updates. And then in the end, we want to look forward and see how can we advance the agenda for integrating human rights in business school education. We have someone joining us from the Case Center, and we'll talk briefly about Prime and our idea of creating regional clusters. So that's today. We have until 10:45 with the online community. If you're joining remotely, warm welcome as well. People here in the room, if you're remote, you need to know this morning it was dark, wet, and cold in Geneva, so the people who made it are very committed, but I'm very happy to have you remotely as well. We will cut the hybrid meeting at 10:45. Many of you will then go to the end forum, but if you still have an hour to spare for debriefing in the room, you can stay. We will be around until 11:45. So that's today, and with this, I think I can hand over. The meeting will be recorded, particularly the first panel, which I can imagine for others who cannot be here today will be interesting as well. With this, I hand over to Dan, who will be moderating the panel. Thank you.
So much, Doro. Actually, I'm the only one without a mic here.
Oh, that's not ideal.
There we go. I just realized that. But thanks so much, Doro. And when Doro asked me to do this, she says you have one job. Get as much out of the panel as possible, but do it within 45 minutes. So I'm going to make sure that we hit that mark and really just say only one word about the topic, and that is that it's about teaching human rights, but it's about doing this in a challenging environment. And I want to emphasize that it's not about whether we should teach human rights in business schools, right? Because we'd be talking to the choir, I think, if that's what it was about. Instead, it's about how to do it meaningfully, how to do it effectively in an environment where there are lots of competing pressures. So we're going to start by talking about those competing pressures. I'm not going to introduce the panel up front. Doro's already introduced half, I think. But as we go, I think the group will get to know each of the panelists. But we'll start with Kirsten. Kirsten Waltenberg is head of human rights at the Volkswagen Group. Now, you took the lead at the human rights lead at Volkswagen in 2022. It's a pretty challenging time when people talk about global supply chains, for example, but your remit was even broader than that, to be an ambassador for human rights. And I don't know enough about the Volkswagen Group, but I know it's very complicated. With more than 1,000 separate units, I think 64,000 suppliers, if I understand things correctly. So it's a very complex environment. So, what does the pressure feel like, look like in a company like Volkswagen when it comes to human rights? And if you could just move very quickly into, what kinds of human rights literacy would you like to see in the type of team you were building?
And all of that in 2 minutes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Talking about pressure, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, so I represent the Volkswagen Group. It's 2,500 entities that are controlled and 700 that are non-controlled. We are very large. Lots of people think they know Volkswagen, but they don't understand that it encompasses Bugatti, Bentley, Skoda, Porsche, Audi, MAN, Scania, and many, many more that we own. So it's very large. It's 700,000 employees. We are the largest corporation in Europe and, of course, then in Germany. And we have 85,000 tier one suppliers, below which there are sometimes up to 30 steps. And a Golf, the normal incinerator car, has 2,500 parts. So you can imagine the vast mass of suppliers that we try to wrap our arms around. You put it correctly. I started in the year that the Ukraine war started, and I try to come up with a sentence, given the time that I'm allocated, to describe the role that I'm in. So you take into account what I just told you, and you think about operational units that have to buy parts, components, all types of parts, from the tiniest bit that cost a few cents to the bigger ones that are the batteries, for example. They have to put them together in production, and then they have to sell them with profit. And you have to imagine it sort of like in the Stone Age, a group of peers that goes hunting for a mammoth, and then compliance, legal, and the human rights officer comes and says, oh, the spears aren't sustainably sourced. Some of the hunters may be having a criminal background, and by the way, we need an agreement between you two so that you know which parts of the mammoth goes to you, and so that's kind of the role. There's no pressure at all. And what I would like to see taught in the business schools is exactly that. It is a necessary role, because if it turns out that the spears weren't sustainably sourced, there are sure to be media people, there are sure to be rating agencies, there are sure to be civil society members. I do not get buckets of mail every week, but I do get a lot of mail. And I get a lot of media requests for interviews and things as such. You will hardly find any of them because I try to take my role in the background more than up front. But it's tangible losses when, for example, rating agencies due to human rights ranks us down. It costs a lot of money in PR and other things if a civil society member publishes a report that is called, for example, some groups that are for sale because they're being sold into slavery. Then the pictures, I don't have to tell you about the pictures and what they do to your business if there is a Volkswagen car and next to it is some people suffering. So in a nutshell, staying within my 2 minutes, that's...
It's rather intense.
Isn't it?
Yeah, much more so than I even envisioned with the 63,000 suppliers. The 85 is crazy, but we're going to come back to that in a second. Michael, from your vantage point at the UN Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, but also because of your experience with USAID prior to that in Latin America, have you seen the environment and expectations as it relates to human rights change? And in particular, what we're interested in is what you think business educators most often miss about the shifts that are occurring.
Great. Well, thanks, Stan, for the question. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm, as you said, fairly new at OSHR, but know from colleagues that are a lot of friends and supporters of our business and human rights work in this room. So it's really, really wonderful to join the conversation, and hope to see many of you at the forum the coming few days. The common thread, I think, between those experiences is that we ignore business at our peril. From a development perspective, we know that for development solutions to scale, they have to be market-based. From an international human rights perspective, it's, I think, long been clear that upholding the dignity of individuals and communities is premised on the roles that various constituencies and stakeholders play, importantly, business among them. And so what I think has become clear, perhaps in the last few years, is that we've moved definitively from expectations on business that are grounded in philanthropy or CSR to really a convergence around mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence and reporting is the new baseline. From Europe to Latin America to Asia, we see the conversation changing from should companies care to how are they preventing harm across their value chain, and even how can states, how can governments oblige them to take these things into account. A lot of this has been focused recently, of course, on the conversation in Brussels, but we see movement everywhere from South Korea to Thailand to Indonesia to Colombia. Now, I think we should acknowledge challenges, I think, is in the title of this session, so it's not one-way travel. Certainly, these things are rarely linear in any area of public policy, and I think this is an example of that. But if you look at the 5, 10, certainly 20-year sweep, we're clearly heading in a particular direction. If you look at things over 3 or 6 months, maybe it looks a little bit messier. But certainly, from the perspective of business education, I think we would argue that the task really is to prepare students for a world in which compliance with human rights-based standards is fast becoming a legal and a financial expectation.
Well, that kind of complexity, going back to Kirstein's initial framing, is pretty important too, right? That when you talk about this compliance and the globalness of this. But I want to just jump to the second mic, right? Mike, it's been a pleasure talking with you about your book several times. But the one thing I want to point to for this conversation is the motto of the Center for Business and Human Rights at Stern School, and that is pro-business, high standards. How has this framing helped you and your colleagues to embed responsibility and human rights in the business curriculum?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thank you all for being here. I think it's critical for us, at least, in a business school and dealing with future business leaders to recognize that there is a real value for business to operate and to operate globally. I am always saying to my students that the biggest change in human rights in the last 50 years is the reduction in global poverty, especially in East Asia, South Asia. And that's a product more than anything else of jobs. And so if you start from that perspective, then the question is, how do you navigate a globalized world in a way that both allows companies to be profitable, but at the same time to act responsibly? So that's an easier, I think for businesses, it's easier to start with that frame. And frankly, as business educators, if we're trying to educate the next generation of business leaders, we don't want them to be basically advocating that the economic system be thrown up in the air. We have to start with the notion there is a market-based system, and the question is how to make it better, and especially at a time, I can say, in the United States where our own government is stepping backwards. I think it's doubly important for business educators and businesses to be thinking, how do we step up and maintain rule of law, stability, predictability, democratic norms that underlie basically a healthy business environment.
Thanks, Mike. That's very helpful. But I'm wondering now, this is the time when Vasanthi magically appears on the screen. Do we have Vasanthi? Srinivasa from Bangalore?
Yes.
Hey, Dan.
Hey,
Well,
what, she won't appear on the screen? Oh, there she is. Great, thank you. I was getting a little worried. It's nice to see you, Vasanthi. Now, you've studied ethics education in South Asia, in India, right? What are the unique circumstances that, or challenges in the region that shape the way human rights is taught?
I think there are 3 or 4 things happening in simultaneity, and I think we've got to recognize that they are all legitimate by themselves, and yet how do we have a conversation on human rights in a way that makes sense for various people? So the first one, if you look at it, there's still deep-rooted philanthropic traditions. And if you look at the composition of the businesses in South Asia, and I'm going to emphasize on India a little more, largely family-owned businesses, large number of them small and medium, many of them a part of domestic supply chains of large corporations, and a few of them on the global supply chains. So at every point in time, the tensions between the philanthropic orientations, which is important given the extent of inequality and poverty that exists in these countries, extremely important, but that tends to come in the way of looking at ethics and corporate responsibility. The blurring of the boundaries still continues, and we had a conversation across educators a few months ago in South Asia who are talking corporate responsibility. And I think even getting this idea that stakeholders and how do you actually place them at the center of conversations is still continues to be a challenge, whatever we may talk about ethics education. The second one in the midst of all of this is the global supply chains and the human rights due diligence and the kind of emphasis from a compliance perspective. And I kind of liked what Kristen was talking about in terms of how do you get suppliers compliant. But the interesting thing is it just compliance that we want across Asia? And in a society that's so heterogeneous, how does compliance go with commitment? How do the legal and the regulatory frame inform and just enable for a conversation on human rights? I think that's the second set of challenges. And last but not the least, I think the word human rights itself is so difficult to bring to the table. And given the varied construction and interpretation of these narratives, Dan, it seems like we coexist in 3 or 4 worlds simultaneously as countries. And I think that's the reality in which business school teachers have to operate and navigate, and more on that in the next round.
Thanks so much, Vasanthi. And I think we also have Solange on the video. Do we? From South Africa, I think in Johannesburg at the moment, right?
I'm here. I'm in Cape Town. I just in my video on. Someone else is going to, I think.
So you've returned from the G20. You're back at home in Cape Town. It's nice to hear you. We cannot see you though. I guess we won't see you. But I want to pick up where.
I had my one, but someone else is controlling my camera on that side and said, "Oh, there we go." Said they would help me. Okay, great. Can you see me?
It's nice to see you again after recently in Ghana at our conference, where we talked a lot about innovation and entrepreneurship. And I want to pick up there with you. Innovation drives business, as we know, and we've entered this new age of innovation with AI. And it has even broader, I think, social implications than many of us even realize at this point. But how should we think about the relationship between innovation and human rights, especially in emerging economies like South Africa?
So, as you all know, we had the G20 and I attended the B20 last week. And so it's great timing. Thanks for inviting me to speak here. The themes, I'm sure, I assume that the world was watching what was happening in South Africa around the G20 and the B20. And the themes there were solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And I think that they very much frame how it is that we see macroeconomic policy as well as the role of business and government in society in this day and age. And at the business school where I teach and work, we talk about the concept of inclusive innovation, which is related to human rights in the sense that it is around how innovation impacts on rights and dignity and social justice. And so inclusive innovation is more conceptually around the participation and inclusion of those who are the beneficiaries or the clients or the customers of innovation. And we talk about a ladder of inclusivity, from identifying needs together to creating solutions together, to creating impact and then transferring knowledge and institutional power. And an example of that in, as you say, the tech space and AI space, which is so critical at this point in time, is actually around a case, a book that we're launching. We're supporting Professor Eldred Jordan to launch in the next few days. He's written a book on the Silicon Empire versus social impact, which is around a platform that he developed called GovChat, that was based on WhatsApp. And during COVID, in order for people in South Africa to access social grants, like for urgent needs like food security, etc., as well as COVID vaccines and information on COVID. So this platform was built off WhatsApp. And then WhatsApp, because it's owned by Meta, was regulating what could and couldn't be used on that platform when it was a service from a government sector, and had other role players in designing and putting it on the WhatsApp platform. So the book is really about how does business support inclusive innovation? How does the private sector work together with the public sector in either making rights accessible or services accessible, or whether it's about accountability or access to information. And I think that it's a really great case study. Hopefully you'll all see the book somewhere and read it. But it's a great case study around inclusive innovation and human rights. And my last point is just going to be that in South Africa, and our constitutional framework on social, economic rights and civil and political rights applies both horizontally and vertically, which means that it doesn't just apply between the state and citizens, it also applies across between private citizens themselves. So the application of human rights is very much entrenched in our constitutional framework as well. And I think that is probably enough for me.
All right, thanks, Solange. You know, we're going to continue our global tour here in a second round, a very quick round, but focus instead of on the pressures, the intense pressures that we're facing, and the shifts that we're seeing in the compliance and the way we think about business and the context of South Asia and South Africa, but focus a little bit more on the way we teach. And I want to start with you, Kirstine, with it sounds to me it's the last thing you need in terms of complexity, but I'm wondering if you could talk with us a little bit about how you see potential collaborations between Volkswagen and business schools in a global environment.
Well, apart from the obvious, where I think it's an expectation from businesses like ours that business schools educate future leaders on the impacts that I addressed earlier. that students understand that human rights infringements is not something that just happens, but what is the consequence of them? If you asked any business leaders around the world whether they want to tolerate human rights infringements in their supply chains or operations, they will all answer in the negative, of course not. But when you tell them it does happen, there is usually a two-way reaction. Either it's rejection, no, it can't be, the denial part, or they wonder how it could happen. And the part of how it could happen is one important factor that I think business schools can teach. I think both of my colleagues to my right have done a wonderful job in the past of extracting some of the causes for that, and other business schools can follow suit. We have people from Asia, we have people from Africa, but I can tell you that human rights abuses do not just happen in the global south, but rather, especially due to the changes that you addressed earlier, in Central and Eastern Europe we see a lot of that, as for example a consequence of the refugee wave from the Ukrainians. So in my practice I see a lot of Ukrainian refugees being exploited. I see them in services and in types of work that they never chose, that they have been pushed into because they were a desperate seek of help themselves. And anywhere in the world where you see human rights abuses, it's either a state-impacted one or it's coming out of poverty. And so addressing the causes and exploring what drives people to abuse human rights, what is the chain of consequence before and after, I think is an important fact. So that business leaders better understand the root causes and where to address them, that it's not enough to just go out there and build some schools in Africa and have a nice sustainability report somewhere. But to understand that there is alternatives to what's happening and how to address them jointly, because it's a universal global legal principle that you're responsible for what you can influence. And this is, by the way, also what the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act addresses. It holds us responsible as German businesses for what happens in our supply chains. And I think without knowing where it's coming from, you can't really address the consequences.
Well, that complexity in a global context, this is very interesting when I think about this, because what I think you're saying is also with business schools, one of the things I like is that there's a business school everywhere, right? So when we talk about what's happening in Eastern Europe, when you talk about South Africa and India, and how do we think about the context and how it fits a global organization like Volkswagen? Thanks for sharing that. But I want to ask a similar question for you, Michael, in a different context, right? With USAID and now the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. How do you think about collaborations with business schools? Because I imagine you're more accustomed to thinking about law schools and policy schools. How do you think about business schools and what do you need to do? What do business schools need to do to build such collaborations?
Great. Yeah. So I think, broadly speaking, the task is to connect global standards, namely the UNGPs, with operational realities. And you're right. Our bread and butter is more. In terms of how we would engage with the academic ecosystem is more naturally, law schools, policy schools, and so forth. But that I think needs to change and evolve, and it has. So let me offer just maybe 3 examples or 3 ideas on how we can do this. From a kind of pedagogical perspective, we of course would encourage business schools to use the materials we've developed on business and human rights, but equally to provide feedback to us about how student-friendly or not those materials are. From the giggles in the room, I suspect the answer is fairly not, so clearly some room for work and conversation there. A second idea would be to take advantage of the UN internship programs, the UN University volunteer framework. That can happen in Geneva, but maybe more interestingly, it can happen in Africa and Latin America, where we have actually significant programs programs running on responsible business conduct. And I think both for us to benefit from the unique perspectives and expertise that business school students bring, but also then vice versa. That's an opportunity that I think we can explore further. And then finally, the area of research, where developing vivid real life case studies can be maybe part of the answer to that challenge of making these standards operationally real for students and practitioners alike, but also, frankly, and coming back to the challenges and the pushback, needing to continually strengthen and articulate the business case for business and human rights.
Yeah, that's very nice that you bring up the research part, because it's something that we don't often talk enough about, that connection between the research and the teaching. Mike, you've been visiting a lot of business schools, talking about your book. How many have you visited in the last
17.
70?
17.
Oh, 17. I thought it was. In these visits, you've learned a lot about what the schools are doing. Can you give us 2 or 3 examples of schools that you think are really moving the needle when it comes to business and human rights?
Sure. One thing that to me is very exciting, and we talked about it at this meeting last year, is to begin to think about localizing these discussions to each region. And we worked with the ILO and with the Qatar Business School to come up with some case studies. They looked at the case studies we had done at NYU and said, these are nice, but they don't really reflect our local reality. So they've done now a dozen case studies. Hopefully we're going to see that published in the coming months. And there are 14 business schools in the MENA region that are going to be the recipients of those case studies in English and Arabic. I think we can see the potential to do that in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. There really is a need for us to take this conversation from the broad international conversation to really applying it in practice in different places. Second thing, I see a number of schools. I've been to MIT 3 times, to Sloan. One of the things we've talked about there is making the case studies much more relevant. I think, and this is a broader critique of business education, I think the Harvard case studies have been seen their day, frankly. They're too slow. They're not contemporary. They're too much like a Disney movie. There's always a happy ending. I think we need to actually have real-life studies that evaluate real challenges, again, without the right or wrong answer, but really in a short amount of time convey to students, these are hard questions, and give them either with case studies or role play ways to really look at the ethical dimensions of what business is about. MIT is doing that in a really interesting way. And finally, I would say Doro and I have done a lot on the research side. Again, Michael mentioned that. We need to move from theory to practice. We need to look at both how we talk to governments and companies, not only evaluating what's going on, but making practical recommendations for how they ought to be operating differently. So I think there's, again, a research function that merges the academic, the theoretical, with practically how do we get business to do a better job on these issues.
Yeah, I've heard that many times in the last several weeks, actually, that one way that we could do a better job with teaching things like human rights in business schools is to do a better job with research. And I appreciate that. Vasanthy, you're welcome to comment on anything you've heard so far, but I'd love to also hear, because you're in Bangalore, I'd love to hear your perspectives on things like the impact of globalization with India, but also technology, given where you're embedded at the IIM in Bangalore.
So I think just talking from my school and our perspective, and I also want to leave with a bit of an innovation on what I've tried to attempt to do over the last couple of years in terms of how you frame business and human rights. I think clearly the first shift that we are seeing is much more integration of environment and environmental issues into from 2 perspectives. One is clearly the risk perspective of the corporation, which is kind of getting highlighted quite significantly. But the other one, I think, for us is really conversations on who is impacted by climate changes. It's the poor, the vulnerable. So those conversations are kind of becoming more center stage in the context of corporations and their duties. The second kind of conversations that are happening is clearly with the manner in which generative AI companies in India have just allowed the telecom operators to provide OpenAI services for free. So as we speak, Perplexity has tied up with a partner and OpenAI has now opened up free OpenAI. In the midst of all this are conversations of three kinds on technology. One is the whole piece on transparency, digital. What is the kind of data you're capturing? It's no longer digital divide. I think the conversations are substantive with phishing attacks and who's getting impacted. So I think the banking sector, the fintech companies, all of them, we are having some of those conversations. Regulators are coming in very strongly, particularly on violations on citizens' rights. I think that's one kind of a conversation. The second conversation, what many yet nascent but is evolving very quickly, is that the kind of water table depletion that we are going to see with increased data centers getting located. Apart from this is, of course, what generative AI and this embracing by all organizations is kind of posing as water table risks. So that's another piece of conversation that's happening sitting here in Bangalore. And of course, much larger conversations on the ethical dilemmas and how do we equip managers to do critical thinking, whether it is on the news that they get or in the way they are getting employees to embrace technologies. Clearly, we are seeing a lot of job losses in the last 1.5 years. So all in all, I think the external environment is just ripe for deep conversations on human rights. So let me just take a minute more and then talk about something that I decided last year, that conversations on business and human rights is not going to be at the level of students and look at executives, but really not the implementers, but how much do boards understand on business rights, business and human rights. And so we decided to take this into an independent director certification course that we are running. Till 3 years ago, I framed this as a responsible business problem. But last year, we just took it into the rooms and said, whose rights are you violating? Clearly quite provocative, and there was a lot of backlash. And the assumption that top management and boards know about business and human rights, I think that's something that we as business school faculty have to challenge those assumptions. I don't think they know. I think what they are fed is a business perspective, not a sustainability or a social and ethical perspective. And I must confess that the last 2 rounds of teaching has been extremely rewarding, both for me as well as the participants, because I think that's a route to discovery. And what we did was tie that up with an assignment where they had to provide recommendations to their boards on what they think are the human rights issues that their organizations are grappling with. And I think 25% of the participants just went back and presented to their board members. And I think that, to me, is extremely insightful. So what do I take away as an educator? That I think it's not enough to sensitize our students, not enough to sensitize implementers, but I think we really have to play an active role in sensitizing the boards. And that's not something that I've heard too many conversations on. Let me stop here. Thank you. Over to you, Dan.
Well, you've put a lot out for us to think about in that short period of time. And I like how you turned a previous comment on its head. And in fact, it's not just the research informing the teaching, but it's the teaching informing the research and how we discover and develop new insights. But I also appreciate your connection to these other challenges. We often think of climate as a science challenge, but it's really a different S. It's a social challenge. So, Lange, I want to press you on a slightly different question that we may have intended to, but a lot of this work that business schools do, I think, can benefit more from the institution for which they're part, right? So many business schools are part of universities, and I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, in addition to picking up on some of your work with entrepreneurs.
Sure. So the Bertha Center that I run and the solution space are both entrepreneurial and innovation hubs with a focus on social justice and human rights. And we exist within the business school, but the Vice Chancellor, who started about a year ago at the University of Cape Town, has also decided that innovation and entrepreneurship should be a cross-cutting theme across the entire university, supporting all faculties, all disciplines at both undergraduate and graduate levels. So it's definitely growing as a thematic focus, but also being acknowledged that entrepreneurial skills and an innovative mindset can benefit everybody within a university environment, as well as helping to grow the economy, create jobs in an economic time in South Africa where growth is limited, jobs are not growing as much as there is a demand and need as young people enter the labor market. So entrepreneurship is being seen a little bit as a silver bullet, which it's not necessarily, I don't think, but those skills that we can impart to young people and at a graduate and postgraduate level can certainly help people to think, even if they are not setting up their own businesses, that they can be entrepreneurial within existing businesses or within existing institutions, which we call intrapreneurial. And so I think that the link back to the original question you had asked me, the link within business schools, trying to develop not just entrepreneurial mindsets as well as skills, but also linking into broader ecosystems as part of the work that we do. So a couple of examples. So we don't only have an MBA curriculum at the business school, we also offer a Master's in Philosophy and Inclusive Innovation, as well as an MCOM in Development Finance. So those are the master's programs at the University in Cape Town, and we also provide scholarships as the Bertha Center for some MBA students and some MPhil students if they have a social impact purpose driven mandate or emphasis. And then we provide support and as alumni, as a community in an ongoing way. And so over the years, an example of one of our alum set up a health enterprise and establishing smart lockers in clinics all over the country where people could get access to their medicines in a very quick way rather than standing in long queues. And this is being rolled out in partnership with the public health system. And so Neo Hutiri is a great case study, if I can call him that, of having gone through a business school curriculum, MPhil, done his research paper, and then established this network of a health enterprise. We are also, I think I already mentioned before, we're part of this broader MasterCard Foundation Health Entrepreneurship Collaborative across 8 African universities, where we are trying to support the education of entrepreneurs with a social impact, as well as link them into private sector funding, whether it's venture capital or catalytic capital, depending on what phase they're at, and then also linking them into, obviously, into the public health system. So that ecosystem support is also really important. I could talk about this for hours, but I don't know if that's it.
Thank you, Solange. It's a brilliant close to I think a diverse round of discussion about what business schools are doing, but also how they're responding to the pressures that companies face globally. So, back to you, Doro. I think we made it within the 45 minutes. In
No,
fact, we put us
fantastic
back
job.
on
Yeah.
track. I wish that we would have left a little bit of time for discussion around the room, but we'll have some time for that,
We
I think,
will
as
have
we
some
go.
time. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you, panelists.
Thank you, everyone. Let's clap. Yeah.